Well, welcome to a delayed politics hub. That was the England manager there, Gareth Southgate, and England captain Harry Kane giving an update ahead of England's first Euros match against Serbia. But let's turn to politics now, shall we? The usual focus, of course, of this programme. But today it did feel like there was another story overshadowing everything. The Princess of Wales, seen in public for the first time since telling the world of her cancer diagnosis. The crowds, of course, cheered as Princess Catherine watched the Trooping the Colour parade with her family. Also watching on, not far away, was the Prime Minister. This was one military event that he did not want to miss. And he must have been wondering, could this be amongst his last in the job? No one knows for sure what's going to happen on the 4th of July, but it does feel, as we reach the halfway point, that there is a weariness, I think, in the Conservative Party. As one senior Tory insider told me today, nobody cares what Rishi says unless it's another gaffe. And at the G7, the goodbyes seemed almost too final. Anything can happen in the next 3 weeks, but Rishi Sunak needs something big. He needs focus to shift away from him and onto the Labour Party. Well, Gurpreet Narwan has been with Keir Starmer today, and she sent us this report.
The NHS, traditionally solid ground for the Labour Party. Sir Keir Starmer is making big promises, but will he put his money where his mouth is? The party says it wants to deliver an extra 40,000 appointments a week and to clear the backlog of those waiting for over 18 weeks for elective treatment. But we still don't know how much the NHS will receive in overall funding under a Labour government.
What we've set out in our manifesto is the first step, which is the down payment on the change that we need, and that is the 40,000 appointments each and every week to reduce the waiting list. It is a first step. We've also set out the money for the mental health professionals that we need in our communities.
But patients here at the Bassett Law Hospital in Nottinghamshire are calling for fundamental reform. Some have been waiting years for treatment.
I paid in national insurance for many years, and I've had to wait all that time. And, it's the same old politicians, going around the factories with hard hats on. And it's so phony, It's old hat, in my opinion. We need to get real, that's what I said to him,
I understand the restraints that the NHS has got upon it. It's stretched to its limit, and it needs more funding, and it does affect people's lives. And I sometimes don't see that people see that effect. When you've got your family, upset for you, it breaks your heart.
And most people in Britain agree. 60% say they want spending on the NHS to increase, even if it means their personal taxes would rise. But both parties are talking down the prospect of tax rises.
I don't find 6 out of 10 people want to pay more tax. I find they want to bring their taxes down. They want better public services. They understand the challenge in the NHS. They also understand it's got record funding and record numbers of doctors and nurses, but we're up against a huge rise in demand, particularly under the pandemic, which is really, really difficult.
Waiting lists, appointment times, junior doctors' strikes. The challenges facing the next government are big and expensive. People here know that, and they want their politicians to be honest about it too. Gurpreet Narwan, Sky News, Nottinghamshire.
Well, political correspondent Rob Powell is with me now. We've seen what Labour have been up to. Tell us a bit about, firstly, what the Prime Minister's been up to, and also there's a poll from Savanta that's just dropped.
Yeah, a quieter day for the Tories in terms of campaigning today. The PM back on kind of prime ministerial duties. We saw him at the Trooping the Colour this morning, of course. He's in Switzerland right now at a Ukraine peace summit. Potentially, I guess, his last international engagement, certainly his last before the general election, potentially his last as Prime Minister, of course. This Savanta poll that's just dropped in the last hour, of course, a lot of interest about whether it mirrored what had been going on in that YouGov poll yesterday that showed Reform pulling ahead of the Tories for the first time. It doesn't show that. It still shows the Conservatives fairly far ahead. But it's more similar to the sort of poll of polls that we do, where we sort of crunch them all together. The gap is still fairly significant, but that's probably the only good news for the Conservatives in that poll. It also shows Labour edging up. It shows the biggest Labour lead over the Tories since Liz Truss was Prime Minister, and it shows the lowest figure for the Conservatives since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. So look, we started this campaign asking whether the Tories could narrow the gap. It looks like it's going the other way. What are they going to do? Well, I think, as you suggested earlier, the focus will continue to be trying to shift it onto Labour. I think talking to Tories, they think that the best chance now is almost not so much to sort of trumpet their own policies, it's to try and make voters realise, as they see it, the risks of a Labour government.
Really interesting stuff. Thanks for bringing us up to date with that poll that's just dropped. Rob Powell there. Well, Sir Philip Davies joins me now for the Conservatives from Shipley. Thanks so much for joining us this Saturday evening. We appreciate it. Now, I think it's fair to say you're someone that's known for being pretty straight talking. Can you tell us how you think the Conservative campaign is going?
Well, it's been tough, Ali. I don't think you need to be Sir John Curtis or anybody like that to work that out. It's been a tough few weeks, but it's always good fun being out on the campaign trail, meeting the voters. And look, what I find speaking to voters in my area is that actually there's a lot of people who haven't made their minds up. I think that it's probably fair to say that they're quite disillusioned with politicians generally, with all the main parties. There's certainly no great desire to see Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner running the country, and so there's a lot of votes up for grabs in the last few weeks of the campaign. That's what I find. But yeah, obviously it's been tough going at the start of the campaign. No one's going to deny that.
Why do you think it's been tough? Do you think someone's to blame? Do you think it's Rishi Sunak's fault?
No, I don't think it's Rishi Sunak's fault at all. No, I mean, I think there's been some unfortunate incidents. I think some of the criticism he's had has been over the top and unfair, to be perfectly honest. I think the media have had this idea that they sort of had a collective game that they're trying to play. Let's see how low we can get the Conservatives in the polls or whatever it might be. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer, who seems to not know from one day to the next what he's talking about, seems to serenely go on without any real challenge from the media. Well, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks, instead of just trying to nitpick on anything that the Prime Minister might or might not do, most of it's sort of trivial stuff. Let's just focus on what Keir Starmer's going to do. Which taxes is he going to increase? Why is it yesterday he couldn't rule out charging capital gains tax on people's prime residences, and Angela Rayner couldn't rule that out 2 days later? When you start doing your job properly in the media and start actually challenging Keir Starmer about what he really believes and what he's really going to do, we might see a bit of a change in the polls.
I can assure you we will be challenging the Labour Party later, but this is about the Conservative Party, and we know that one poll yesterday showed Nigel Farage's party ahead of the Conservatives. How worried are you about the threat from the right?
Well, as you say, it was one poll. It was one poll, YouGov, which has consistently had reform much higher than everybody else. In fact, you get to the point where you think that YouGov are a campaigning organisation masquerading as a polling company, to be perfectly honest. So far out are they from other people. That isn't what I find on the doorstep. But yes, look, there are lots of people who agree with what Nigel Farage says. I'm one of those people. I agree with lots of what Nigel Farage says. If you sat me and him down in your studio next to each other, you'd probably find that we wouldn't be disagreeing on many issues. But the fact of the matter is that Nigel, who I'd be bold enough to call a friend, Nigel saying that, he's the leader of the opposition 1 minute, and the next day it's saying we might win 2 seats, and his deputy leader saying, well, we might even win 4 seats. That shows what the situation really is. It's that voting reform is voting for Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister with a big majority. And so what we've got to do is persuade Conservative voters not to be seduced by this sort of Farage mania, like Clegg mania in 2010 that the media are trying to whip up, and actually show that actually if you vote, Keir Starmer wants you to vote reform.
Some people in your party think he should be embraced by the Conservatives. You say you agree with him on some things. Do you think that's right?
Well, it's crazy that Nigel Farage and me are standing against each other in an election in different parties. It's crackers. And the only person who benefits...
Should he join your party then, do you think?
Well, I would like to see that. Yeah, I'd like to see Nigel Farage. He's a Conservative. Of course, he's got Conservative views. We agree with each other on many issues. All Nigel Farage is doing at this election, and I'm sure it's doing his ego, which is already the size of a small plant, a lot of good. But all he's doing, aside from massaging that ego, is helping Keir Starmer build as big a majority as possible in Parliament. And we've got to remind voters that, you know, if you don't want socialism on steroids with your home being taxed and all the rest of it, that you're not really doing a particularly good job at highlighting at the moment what's coming down the line. We've got to remind people that voting for Nigel Farage is not going to do you any good. On the day after the election, I suspect all those people who do vote Reform will think, what on earth have we done? If at the end of it, all they find is that Keir Starmer's in Downing Street introducing socialism on steroids. So we've got to win people back over the next few weeks. It's going to be difficult. We've got a mountain to climb, clearly, but it's not impossible. And the Labour Party is such a danger to the country. We've got to keep fighting.
Do you think I think the problem for a lot of people is kind of trust. Do you think this government's being honest enough about its record? You once said that Boris Johnson was the most left-wing Prime Minister since Harold Wilson. I guess, do you stand by that, and do you think he's the source of some of these problems?
Well, obviously, I mean, you just have to look at the immigration figures, which are far too high, which are a result of Boris Johnson's liberal attitude towards immigration. Thankfully, Rishi Sunak, since the start of the year, has radically changed the immigration rules, so those figures are going to come right down as he's basically stopped student dependents coming into the country and increased the amount that people have to earn before they come into the country. So yes, we had the proper socialism of the lockdowns, which I was completely opposed to at the time, which was which obviously the media were agitating for, as well as the opposition. That's why our taxes are so high. That's why our debt's so high, because we spent £400 billion protecting people during a lockdown. So of course, yes, that was far too left wing. Boris was a fanatic for net zero. Rishi Sunak has been pushing back the date when we're going to be banning diesel cars and petrol cars. I'd like him to go further, but that's a step in the right direction. Keir Starmer's going to reverse that delay. So yes, I mean, Boris did introduce a much more left wing regime. I think over the last 14 years, we've had 3 once in a century issues to deal with: a financial crash aftermath that we had to pick up the pieces from. Remember, there is no money. We had to deal with that. We had the COVID pandemic and a war in Europe. And not many governments have 3 once-in-a-century issues to deal with over the last 14 years. And I don't believe that the Labour Party would have dealt with them any better, frankly. But look, elections are about the future, not about the past. It's a referendum on the future, as Bill Clinton rightly said. And we've got to point out that actually people will be a lot better off with a Conservative government than they will be with the disaster of Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner introducing their socialist manifesto.
Sir Philip Davies, thanks so much for your time. We always do get some straight answers from you, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, just a moment ago, I talked to Labour's Shadow Health Minister, Andrew Gwynne. I started by asking him about Labour's social care plan. It was a single page in their manifesto with not much detail, really, on what specific money would be used to fund it.
So what we've said is that we need to start that journey of reform, of fixing our broken social care system, and we'll start that by ensuring that the staff who work in social care have that fair pay agreement. So that is something that we will do from the moment that a Labour government, if we are trusted to serve this country, will put in place. But beyond that, it's about ensuring that we improve our social care services and have a national care service. This is a decade plan to reform social care into a system that wraps around the needs of the individual in a way that, quite frankly, social care services don't at the moment. A national care service, that is our ambition. And we want to take the sector on that journey of reform and of renewal, so that social care becomes a service that is at the heart of ensuring that people can live the best lives possible, which is what social care ultimately should be about.
To make that work, you need money. Can you just be clear on how you're going to pay for that?
So what we've said, firstly, with the fair pay agreements, is that that will be paid for in part by the sector themselves. Having a floor, a minimum floor, actually improves recruitment and retention within social care. So there is some flexibility there within the system. But look, in the long term, we need to ensure that the money that is...
Can you just explain that a bit more clearly in terms of where the money is actually coming from?
So the money will come from a variety of sources, not least that by improving and changing the way we do healthcare in England means that we free up resources to shift people out of hospital and to spend that resource within the community. So it's not just about new money, it's about spending the money, the many billions of pounds that we spend on health and care within a hospital setting, when actually better care and better outcomes can be provided within the home setting. So it is that shift from hospital to community, from analog to digital, and from a system that fixes people when they're broken to one that prevents people from getting sick earlier or altogether. So it's quite a transformative programme of renewing health and social care in this country, not as individual different silos, but as a single programme of making Britain healthier and more equal.
I mean, you've said yourself, your party said there's a crisis in social care. You talk about freeing up resources, about moving things around, but it just sounds a bit more like a kind of ambition, a long-term hope, but it doesn't seem like there's a kind of concrete plan for exactly how it's going to be paid for.
Well, look, there is a concrete plan in where we want to get to. That is a national care service. But I can't wave a magic wand with the social care system that we would likely inherit and fix it overnight. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to ensure that the workforce is valued and that people who work in social care have those fair pay agreements in place, but also have better terms and conditions. So, for example, ensuring that they don't have taken into account the journey times between caring for people, which is often the case now. So it's about those better terms and conditions. The second thing is about transforming social care from a system that looks after people and it's very hit and miss, there is a postcode lottery, to one that has national standards at the heart.
I want to just ask you a bit about when you were in Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet, because you were also his national campaign coordinator. You know, you were effectively kind of in charge of the election strategy. Did you think he was going to win the election?
Well, look, we didn't win the election and we were defeated badly. Well, I will always campaign for a Labour government because any Labour government, I believe, is better than a Conservative government. But look, we didn't win. And you have to listen to the electorate. The electorate said the Labour Party was miles away from where they wanted us to be. And so we've made some very difficult choices over the last 4.5 years, and Keir Starmer has changed our party. The fact that just 4.5 years since that devastating defeat, that we are now talking about the realistic prospect of a Labour government.
Sorry, I just really want an answer to the question. At the time, did you think that Jeremy Corbyn could win?
Look, I saw what the opinion polls were saying, I heard what the focus groups were saying, and I knew that it would be a very difficult ask for Jeremy Corbyn to be the Prime Minister. But I'm a Labour MP. I support the Labour leader. And that's what I did in 2019, 2017, 2015, 2010, 2005. But I believe we are on the cusp of real change with Keir Starmer here, and not talking the talk. We will get the chance to deliver change and make that better, fairer, more equal Britain that I want to see.
Well, lots to chew over there. Let's bring in our duo for this evening, Mo Hussein and John Rentoul. Thanks so much for coming in. John, I think this is your second Saturday in a row, so
I love it so much.
Delighted that you're giving up this prime time. Let's start with you. I mean, what did you think? Did you listen to Andrew Gwynne there? I did. I answered the questions.
Well, I heard you giving him a very hard time, just as Philip Davies accused you of not doing. You did give him a hard time about where Labour would get the money from for its ambitious policies.
This is obviously going to be massive. It's a huge part of fixing the crisis in the NHS.
Yeah, and he just waffled on about reallocating resources within the NHS budget, and that's not really good enough. So that's your answer to Philip Davies, who I thought was extraordinary, really. I mean, just saying Boris Johnson was the most left-wing Prime Minister since Harold Wilson. I mean, more left-wing than... I mean, that makes him more left-wing than Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, James Callaghan. Extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, there was quite a lot in that Philip Davies interview to chew over, I thought. And I think he said that he would welcome Nigel Farage into the party. It was certainly implied he would.
Yeah, he did. I'm not sure what happened with the broadcast grid tonight, but I'm not sure his interview was the most helpful for the Conservative side, because there are very senior Conservatives who don't agree with that, including the Foreign Secretary David Cameron said so this morning. This again paints the divided party, which this stage in the election, where 3 weeks to go, where the polls aren't shifting, in some cases getting worse, that doesn't really give people much reassurance or anything like that. And I think, you know, what he said also points to this strategy we're seeing now, which is let's just not talk about the record we have to defend or to point to, and let's just focus on socialising that we're going to lose, and therefore let's limit the Labour majority, which again is not going to be reassuring to people knocking on doors, candidates who want to see a bit more hope.
John, I mean, do you think we've seen it feels like we've seen a bit of a change in strategy from the Conservative Party this week, talking about Labour supermajorities.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's going to work, that tactic?
No, I don't. I mean, I agree with Mo. I mean, if you go and knock on the door and say, can you vote for a small Labour majority, not a large one? It's not a very strong message, is it? I mean, if you've got a blue rosette on.
And do you think we are giving the Labour... Do you think the focus is so much on the Prime Minister? Do you think that Labour are getting enough attention?
No, well, Keir Starmer is playing a very, very effective defensive game, put it that way. And, you know, you've got Labour spokespeople on your programme, and I mean, they are out and about being asked questions, but they are playing turtle. I mean, they just roll over and won't answer difficult questions, as Philip Davies would like them to. And it's a very effective strategy.
And, I mean, we've just had the latest poll showing the Conservatives going down 4 points, yeah. I think. So it doesn't seem like, you know, is there anything in the next few weeks, we're halfway through now, they can do to recover?
It's really difficult to see that. You would think after manifestos where you have the more comprehensive policy offering that there would be some kind of bounce or some kind of shift. That hasn't happened so far. And there aren't any big policy moments left that we know of. So we had the first few weeks of Conservatives throwing out very big new ideas, which, you know, were not universally well received, but created a debate to try and cut through because they felt nobody was listening anymore. It seems like that hasn't worked. And without having anything up that they can present as a new thing for the country going forward, it's hard to see how they can shift the polls. And I think the real unexpected part of this whole campaign so far has been the threat from the right and Nigel Farage and Reform. And there'll be many people questioning whether if we had actually delayed the election and gone later in the year, would he have been busy in America, and would we have seen the same impact of the right or not?
Do you think Labour are worried about Reform at all? Because it does look, according to the polls, like they are taking some votes off Labour as well.
Well, that's right. Except, I mean, the Savanta poll you mentioned has Labour going up 2, I think.
I actually don't have it in my hand. I will check that. Yeah.
No, which is interesting because, as you say, Labour and Conservatives have both been going down, and Reform and the Lib Dems have been gaining. But I mean, actually, that's fine for Labour, because as long as the gap between Labour and the Tories stays as big as it is, and as long as they have such a huge lead, they shouldn't be too worried about that. But, you know, unexpected things can happen, and Mo's right. I mean, this is the thing that has happened in this campaign that people weren't expecting was Nigel Farage, and that was one of the reasons why we thought why Rishi Sunak called the election early was to dish Farage, but it actually had the opposite effect. It would have been better to do it later.
Yeah, the Farage factor remains to be seen exactly how much of an impact that's going to have. We'll come back to you both later. Thanks so much for now. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we hear from a former Tory Justice Secretary who gave a surprising answer on the question of who he'll be voting for on the 4th of July. Plus, Nigel Farage declares Reform UK the opposition. We'll examine whether his party's good polling numbers will translate into actual votes. And Rishi Sunak says he'll stay on as an MP if the Conservatives lose the election. We'll look at how long other PMs have lasted in Parliament.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Welcome back. Well, this week I spoke to David Gauke, a former Tory cabinet minister and now a former Tory full stop, who knows better than most what it's like to be inside the battle for the heart of the Conservative Party. I asked him whether he'd be voting Tory at this election.
I'm considering my options at this point. I don't think it'd be good for the country if essentially the Conservative Party is completely destroyed and Labour has a sort of massive majority. Certainly, if I was living in a constituency where I was confident the Conservative candidate would be someone who would stand up to Nigel Farage, would resist moves to turn the Conservative Party into a sort of fully fledged populist party of the right, I think I would be very minded to vote Conservative. But you know that really does depend upon the individual candidates, because I think there is going to be a big battle in the Conservative Party at the end of this process as to whether they open the door to Nigel Farage. And I think if the door is opened, then the Conservative Party is going to change fundamentally and quite possibly permanently. So look, you know, I won't list individual names, but there are certainly a lot of Conservative candidates I would vote for if I lived in their constituency this time round. Not about who governs the country, but about hoping that we can preserve a mainstream centre-right alternative to the Labour Party.
That's really interesting. And I mean, if you're considering not voting Conservative potentially, what party would you vote for?
I'm not entirely sure which way I will sort of particularly go. None of the other parties particularly excite me. Look, again, there are aspects of the Liberal Democrats. I think if they were more of the kind of Orange Book version, prepared to, be more pro-business, if you like. Actually, if they're prepared to be a little bit more open about the need for a closer relationship with the European Union, I might be tempted. But just at the moment, I would consider myself to be sort of politically homeless. Again, there are probably individual Liberal Democrat candidates I might be persuaded to vote for. But, at the moment, I don't see the Liberal Democrats sort of filling the role that is, I think, necessary in this country, which is a second party, willing to go into government, with ambitions to form a government, internationalist by nature, pro-business by nature, fiscally conservative and responsible.
Thanks so much. We've run out of time, but in a word, do you think the Conservatives can still win this election?
In a word, no.
Well, there you have it. Let's bring John and Mo back in. John, what did you think of that? I mean, I know he hasn't been a particularly loyal Conservative.
No, and he didn't say where he's voting and who his candidates are.
Yeah, he implied he could be persuaded by the Lib Dems.
Yeah, but I've always thought he sounds increasingly like a New Labour politician to me. I mean, he's pro-European, he's centrist, and he's rather an admirer of Tony Blair, I think.
Good point. And Mo, I mean, we're going to have a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party if the Conservatives lose. Which direction do you think it's inevitable that the party will tack to the right now?
Yes, I think it is. I think the moves are already afoot, and there'll be the blame game. You know, was the Prime Minister conservative enough? Did he really believe in the project? Did he believe in the things that the base believe in? And you've had lots of reinventions of Rishi Sunak. So he has veered to the right, pushing the Rwanda plan, and then he had this kind of one nation moment, bringing back David Cameron into his cabinet, and all of these reinventions haven't really shifted the dial, and also have left one group unhappy, which is, you know, the nature of politics. It is a lot of the party management. But I think if he loses, and loses quite dramatically, then there will be people who are already waiting in the wings, let's be honest about that, ready to pounce and ready to go and say, look, we should have been stronger on immigration, we should have been stronger on things like the ECHR, on tax in general, and they may well have their time in the sun.
Yeah, it does feel like there are a few people waiting in the wings. We will come back to you both. But first, coming up next on the Politics Hub, Nigel Farage declares Reform UK the opposition, and his party overtakes the Tories for the first time. But will he convert those numbers into actual seats? We'll examine how polls bear out. Rishi Sunak pledges to stay on as an MP if the Conservatives lose the election. We'll look at how other PMs have fared after standing down. Well, welcome back. With less than 3 weeks until votes are cast, the polling figures we're seeing through this election campaign are pretty extraordinary. Not only have we seen Labour open up a 20-point lead on the Conservatives, but in recent days, Reform UK, a relatively newcomer to British politics, have made such big gains that in one poll, they are actually ahead of the Conservatives. Worth saying, it is all within the margin of error. Well, let's bring our panel back in, shall we, Mo and John, because we're going to talk about some old polls as well. But I guess, John, it is unusual for the polls to stay so, when it comes to the Labour Party, so kind of steady.
So steady until the one thing happened. I mean, the polls have been completely steady for a whole year and a bit more, with Labour 20 points ahead or 21 points ahead. And then the only thing that's happened is Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has come back as leader of Reform and is standing for Parliament. And suddenly Reform, which had been sort of bubbling about, suddenly shoots up, and the Conservatives drop down, but Labour also dropped down at the same time, which is odd, because it's not Labour voters going to Reform. I think it's a sort of reshuffling of the Labour Lib Dem sort of tactical vote going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Absolutely fascinating. Who knows how that's going to work out?
Should we look at some past? I thought it would be interesting to look at some of the previous polls, because it kind of gives you a bit of a sense of where we're at now. So this was 2019, obviously Boris Johnson winning that big majority. But, you know, there were moments where they weren't, you know, Jeremy Corbyn's party was not far off. What do you think when you kind of look back at some of these old polls, Mo?
So I think these are good for capturing sentiment at given points in time, but there is a difference between how people respond to people calling up and saying, how are you going to vote, and then what actually happens on the day. And we've seen that some of the polls don't always bear that much resemblance to the final outcomes. It also seems to me that a lot of people, and especially in this election, have already made their minds up, and they may have made their minds up quite a while ago. And then so this 6-week period that, you know, politically reconstruct as the short campaign doesn't really mean much to most people. You know, they might see the Prime Minister or the opposition a bit more, but is there any game changers in this? Are people paying attention just because we're in the short campaign or not? And I'm not convinced that they fully are.
It's interesting. Well, I guess the argument could be that the exception to that was 2017. If we go to that, you know, Theresa May had a huge poll lead, 20 points before calling the election, I think, and we all know what happened in the end. And I can also show you 2015. We'll rattle through some of these old polls because I do think it is quite interesting. I think in the end, Labour were just ahead of the Conservatives, and of course, David Cameron won that election. Looking back at this, John, what was your take?
I'd forgotten that. I mean, the 2015 election was a real Tory triumph, actually, of recognising that they could squeeze the Lib Dem vote, because in the end, you know, Labour did quite well. I mean, there was actually a small swing to Labour, but it was completely offset by the Conservatives crushing Nick Clegg's party, and that's what won it for them.
Is there something that could happen in the next 3 weeks that could shift the polls?
I don't think so. I mean, unless there's a huge unforced error and the Bing bars that the Labour Party are holding just drops and shatters into a million pieces, I don't think we've seen that that's going to happen. It's been a very controlled campaign so far. And I think also a lot of people do feel, you hear it a lot, when we think of people's experiences with the state or with the government, you know, it feels quite intangible, but a touch point is the NHS, for example. A lot of people will base government delivery on can they get an appointment or not, and that may well be the thing that drives the vote rather than anything in terms of high-level politics. And I think if those issues are not going to suddenly change in the next 3 weeks, then they're lodged into people's minds.
OK, thanks both. We will, of course, come back to you. Well, throughout the election campaign, our home editor, Jason Farrell, is travelling across Britain with a parliamentary bench, offering voters a chance to take a seat and tell us what is really important to them. He started in Cornwall, where our bench across Britain made its first stop, then to a cheese rolling event in Gloucestershire. Up next, he arrived at a school in the Bedfordshire town of Luton, and now he's at a kabaddi sporting event in Southall and a Gurdwara in Gravesham to speak to the Sikh community about the issues they care about in the general election.
Described as Sikh sumo wrestling, the ancient game of kabaddi originated as a military training exercise on how to take captives and win territory, now a fixture in the UK Punjabi calendar. And Sikh votes are a battleground in this election. Spectators here come from constituencies across the country.
You tend to get a lot of injuries.
Their vote matters in numerous areas. In Southall, known as the Little Punjab, Sikhs make up 30% of the population. So we've brought our parliamentary bench here to test the mood.
So the current cost of living, as we all know, is through the roof. And it's becoming extremely difficult to live and sustain within this environment. Evident that with the amount of homeless on streets.
I've been here a long time now, but I've never seen nothing change. It's gone up and up. Every government come in, they promise a lot of things. We do this, we do that, we do this, but nothing happens again.
PM Rishi Sunak, a Hindu, has Punjabi origins, but is he getting their vote?
Well, I mean, I think he was a better chancellor than he was a prime minister. I think the position the party finds itself generally, that really hasn't helped his cause.
The athletes here represent Sikh communities across the UK. This team is from Gravesend in Kent.
Yeah, Gravesend.
In a target seat for Labour, Gravesham. Home to the largest Gurdwara in the UK.
The Sikh community can be quiet influencers in elections. We don't hear from them much, but they are concentrated in certain areas, and they can tip the balance in places like here, Gravesham, where they make up 8% of the population.
Surveys we've done suggest 85% of Sikhs actually come out and vote. There are probably 1 million Sikh voters. We have towns and cities where there are 20, 25,000 Sikhs. And therefore, the Sikh vote really matters on the 4th of July.
So how can politicians appeal to these worshippers? Many said they want a public inquiry into British government involvement in events leading up to the infamous Sikh massacre in India in 1984. And to hear more from politicians about protecting their communities.
Yeah, Islamophobia, Semitism is widely recognised for specific hate crime. However, nothing exists for the Sikhs. But because of our dress, we can become targets of hate crime exactly the same manner as Muslims do.
Because at the end of the day, I feel like we represent the nation very well. You know, we hold its core values, and as a community, we are very tight-knit and close-knitted.
They pride themselves on being humble, shrewd, community-minded, and incredibly polite.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry.
And in places, their vote can carry a seat.
Looking very stylish, Jason.
Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Jason Farrell reporting there. Well, still to come on the Politics Hub, Rishi Sunak pledges to stay on as an MP if the Conservatives lose the election. We'll examine how long other PMs have lasted in Parliament after standing down.
It's catastrophic, and you said it's more than a year now, and actually the situation is rapidly deteriorating. Right now there's a huge battle ongoing in North Darfur in the city of Al-Fashir, and we are seeing relentless bombing of the city, civilian infrastructures being destroyed, people having to flee but having nowhere to flee. And we are seeing also massacres in the middle of the country. Just last week, 100 of civilians were killed by the Rapid Support Force just in one day, in one village. And on top of this, we're looking at the largest hunger crisis in the world right now unfolding. It's really terrible. My colleague just left Al-Fashir last week, and it was a very treacherous journey. It was a horrible journey, and he had stayed, the longest time there. And he was telling me, people were queuing in the street to get water. There was huge shortages of water, of food. Nobody could reach to the hospital. A lot of wounded actually never made it to the hospital during the fighting. And the warring parties are completely not respecting any civilian infrastructures. The hospital was raided, and this is North Darfur, but across the entire Darfur, which is as big as Spain, people are struggling. My team's underground. I think people who cannot afford even a meal a day. They're eating soil. They're eating leaves. Women have to sell themselves, their body for food. We have people who have to sell their, they live in shelters, shelters like you see on the picture, and they have to sell their roof in order to afford a meal. The situation is really bad, and you have people who are either going to be killed by violence or killed by hunger. The gravity of the situation compared to the attention that the international community is given is unspeakable. I have no word to express how much neglected Sudan is. I mean, the international community has had now a year of everyday fighting, and yet it has still not come up as a group at high level to stop to engage with the warring parties and stop the fighting.
Well, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Rishi Sunak has promised to stay on as an MP this week for the full 5-year term should the Conservatives lose the election. And it got us thinking here, how long do former Prime Ministers usually stay in the Commons after standing down? Well, let's bring our panel in, and I will reveal the answers in a minute. But who do you think of the last kind of 5 Prime Ministers has stayed in Parliament the longest? Mo?
I think probably Theresa May.
Good answer.
Last 5.
Yes.
It wasn't David. Well, David Cameron said he was going to stay the whole term, and then decided not to. So yeah, it must be Theresa May, isn't it?
Well, it's actually, I can reveal in our photo, nearly by a few days.
Oh, wow.
Gordon Brown. There you go. Those are the stats. So Boris Johnson, he. Obviously,
he chickened out of fighting a by-election in Uxbridge, which he could have won. And
actually, that would have probably worked quite well for him. But he did stand down, and Theresa May and Gordon Brown, the longest standing. I mean, do you think it's good to have former Prime Ministers in Parliament? Do they add to the debate?
I think experience and wisdom and people who have been there and done that is always useful. And you see, certainly with Theresa May, she has been quite critical of decisions some of the governments succeeded her have made. And I think having that elder statesperson is definitely a good thing.
Yeah.
You've got Gordon Brown. I mean, although he wins the score, he was hardly ever in Parliament for that term after he stood down. I do think Tony Blair ought to get some credit for absolute decisiveness. On the day he stood down as Prime Minister, he stood down as an MP. I mean, partly because it would have caused endless trouble for him to hang around while Gordon Brown was Prime Minister.
I can't see him as a backbencher.
So that was a sensible thing to do.
Prime Minister. And David Cameron, of course, said he was going to stay, and then he didn't. So it remains to be seen whether
when Rishi says he's going to stay. I mean, I hoped Rishi Sunak would stay and try and do what Michael Howard did, which is change the leadership election rules for the Tory party after he stood down, which he tried to do but failed because he didn't get the majority he needed. But I think Rishi's authority is going to be shot because he's going to have lost the election so badly.
I don't think the Prime Minister can say anything else at this stage. You're halfway through an election campaign. If he suddenly is talking about, well, one, presumption going to lose, and then I also won't be around for the next Parliament. What impact does that have on people, again, knocking on the doors, campaigning, trying to get re-elected? So, of course, he has to say that he will stay for the full term. Whether that happens or not is another question.
I should say that we don't have Liz Truss on this graphic because she is actually standing to be an MP.
Yes.
Which is what a lot of people thought she wouldn't do that. So we didn't want to put a number on because it might be unfair because maybe she will stay for a long time. I mean, do you think Liz Truss would be valuable in the House of Commons?
No, not really. She wasn't valuable as a Prime Minister, and she should never have been Prime Minister, as she sort of admitted after 7 weeks of trying.
Mo, what do you think? I mean, you've got to admire her for going for it again, for fighting her seat.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think, you know, look, she has been a bit of a liability to the Conservative campaign. She's the obvious attack point for the opposition, and she also is not supportive of the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister. So
what is the point of her? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. OK, thank you both so much. It's been a wonderful panel, hasn't it, this evening? That is it from us tonight. We will be back tomorrow at 7. Up next, we've got the highlights from our Battle for Number 10 Leaders event. But from all of us on the Politics Hub, not long to go till the end of this general election campaign.